Hi, thanks for taking the time to check out my video. Today I'm going to be implementing some code, writing some code where I implement a PSR-15 compliant microframework using a personal project that I've been putting a lot of time into called Annotated Container, as well as some other popular open source libraries. So let's start looking at some code. We're going to start by taking a look at the dependencies that we're going to install today. The first annotated container is a dependency injection framework that we're going to use to configure all of the services and the factories for our microframework. Next are a couple Laminus libraries that are used for the PSR-7 and PSR-15 aspects and really take care of the request response cycle. Next is Monolog to take care of our logging, Fast Route to take care of our routing, and PHP-DI as our backing container. Annotated Container has the concept of bringing your own container, and it has out-of-the-box support for PHP-DI as well as another container called RD Lowry Aron. We chose PHP-DI today. So let's go ahead and install these dependencies. Dependencies installed with no problem. So we're going to create a configuration for Annotated Container so that it knows what directories to scan and other details about creating your container. You can do that by running the vendor bin annotated container init command. What this is going to do is going to take a look at your composer.json, and all of the directories that you have configured is just going to be the default. So you can see that there's a directory called annotated container cache created, as well as an annotated container.xml file. Inside it is the source directory that we have defined in the composer.json, as well as some other configuration, some empty configuration that we don't need to worry about just yet. I'm going to disable the cache for now. Since it's a demo, we don't want that to necessarily get in the way. The next thing that we want to do is create the entry point for our application, the script that gets ran when a request comes in. We're going to call this app.php. It's going to be a PHP file, and it will wind up including our autoloader and will kind of bootstrap our application. So Annotated Container provides an object appropriately enough named called Bootstrap. And since we're using all defaults today, we don't have to worry about any of the parameters that might get passed in here. So we now have a PSR-11 compliant container, and we're going to want a handler runner. Specifically, we're going to want a request handler runner interface, which is an implementation or an interface provided by one of the Laminus libraries. It has a method on it called run, and when it gets invoked, it's going to kick off that request response cycle for us. So we're at the point to where we can use PHP's built-in development web server and actually take a look at this. It's going to be an error. We fully expect this to fail because we haven't defined what these interfaces should actually be yet. But let's go ahead and get the server running. And let's go over to Firefox and open that up. So we've got Firefox here, and we've got, so as you can see, we get the error just like we expected. Annotated Container is telling us that it doesn't know what service we're talking about here. So let's go ahead and get back to the code, and we're going to go ahead and define those services. So we do that in Annotated Container primarily by using attributes, but since these are third-party services, we can't put attributes on them, right? So Annotated Container provides a functional API where everything that you can do with an attribute, you can do with the functional API as well. So I like to put my implementations for all the Annotated Container stuff that I'm about to talk about inside the AutoWire namespace, you can feel free to use whatever namespace is appropriate for you and your team. So we're going to create a definition provider, and then we're going to implement the definition provider interface provided by Annotated Container, and we're just going to give that an alias so it doesn't conflict with our stuff. So then that implements Annotated Container definition provider, and that interface has one method on it called consume, and it's going to take a definition provider context object. All of the functions that we're going to call require this object. All of the functional API requires this object. And this object just keeps track of all of the container definitions that would get created for these function calls. So let's go ahead and add our first service, which again requires the context, and it's going to be our request handler runner interface. I know that the implementation of this interface requires an emitter, so we're going to go ahead and take care of that now as well. And then our fast route is going to be an interface it calls a dispatcher, and that's effectively going to be our router. So our last service is going to be a logger. We're going to want to log some information. So now we have these interfaces. We can go back to Firefox, and what we're going to wind up seeing here is another error, but it's going to be, well, I'm sorry, excuse me. Let me backtrack. Let me do the right thing here. We actually need to configure Annotated Container correctly. So we created a definition provider. We need to tell it to use that definition provider. So we're going to come into our annotated container.xml and add that to our configuration. So we've got our definition provider here. So now if we were to go back to Firefox and rerun our script, we should see a different error in that now Annotated Container knows about our service, but it doesn't know what implementation to use. So let's just take a look at how that error message changes, and you can see that now PHPDI actually is giving us an invalid definition that it doesn't know how to resolve the request handler runner interface, which is fully expected, and we're going to fix that now. What we're going to do is create those implementations. And we're going to do that by using the factory pattern, and inside Annotated Container, we do that by using a service delegate attribute. What this attribute is saying is that, hey, container, instead of trying to construct this service yourself, delegate construction of the service to this factory method. We're going to implement a factory class, and it's going to have a series of static methods on it. Generally, I would suggest that you have these methods be perhaps their own implementation instead of all grouped together, but that may be how you prefer doing things. And for a micro framework, it makes sense. So we're going to go ahead and create our request handler interface, and we're going to, again, use that service delegate attribute. Let's go ahead and start creating that implementation, and it's going to be a request handler runner, and this has 4 dependencies. The first dependency is a request handler interface. We're going to pass null to it, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. The next is the emitter that we were talking about before. Service delegates can define other services that it would depend on, and those will get injected when the method is invoked. So we're going to pass in that emitter, and then we need 2 callables. The first is going to create a server request using the one of those Laminus libraries that I was talking about, and then the next is what happens when you have an error. So all of our responses today are going to be really basic, plain text responses, basically. We don't want to get too caught up on what the responses look like. We just want to show that we're going to the correct place. In this case, if you're getting this, you're getting an internal server error, and you should probably get a 500 status code. Next, let's create our emitter. And that's going to implement an emitter interface. And again, we want to attribute that with service delegate. This one has no dependencies, it's just an SAPI emitter. So next we have a router. In fast route terminology, that is a dispatcher. And we're going to use a simple dispatcher function here. And we're going to wind up coming back to this in just a moment and filling this up with routes once we have some routes to fill with. So now we need our logger. We need to log some information, and we're going to use a logger, and we're going to call this our Annotated Microframework, and we're going to have a new stream handler, and we're going to call, we want this to go to standard out, and we want, actually, let's not get that fancy. Let's just use what comes out of the box. So again, service delegate. So now what we have here are all of our third-party services defined. We still have that null pointer error. The request handler runner needs a request handler to act as the front controller. In our case, we're going to call this the application. And we're going to create an application in the source directory, of course. And it's going to implement that request handler interface. And it's going to be a service itself that winds up getting injected into that request handler runner. So let's add these methods, and this is going to have some dependencies of its own, right? So we want to have our dispatcher, a router, and we want a logger so we can log some information out. So we've got a couple things we need from the request. The first is a method, and then the path. And these are really all the things that we need right now for what we're trying to do. So let's go ahead and fix this syntax error. And so how fast route works, first let's actually log this information out. Normally we use like a PSR level log messenger, log processor that would log this a little bit more appropriately. But let's just keep it simple for now. Routing, method, and path. And method and path. So we've got some log information, and now let's actually get our route going. So we've got our router, and it's going to dispatch out to the method and path. And the route info here is going to wind up being a tuple. A variable length tuple that will wind up having some information in it that we need. The first is the status. The first potential status could be when it is not found, and in that situation we want to return a response that has a body where we just say that it's not found. Not getting too caught up on the content, just to make sure that we're going to the right place right now. So then we need to account for method not allowed, and we're going to do the same thing. And if memory serves correctly, this is going to be a 405 status code. So if memory doesn't serve correctly and that's not the correct code, then please consider it an exercise left to the viewer to put the correct code in there. Next, and that's all of the error conditions we need to concern ourselves with. At this point, if our route comes in, then we have something. So let's get our handler from the next piece of this tuple. And we can be confident that this is going to be a request handler because of how we're going to set our routes up. And so for all this needs to do right now is handle the request. So now we can go back and fix that null pointer error in our factory. We're going to specify that we want our application and then pass that into the request handler runner. All right. So at this point, we have a working application effectively that at least shouldn't error out. And if everything is working correctly, should give us the not found message in the 404 block. We have everything attributed correctly. So let's go ahead and go back to Firefox and run this command. And you can see that we do indeed get that not found error. So perfect. That's what we expect to see at this point. So let's get back to the code, and we're going to start thinking about routing and how we're going to implement that in our microframework. So the first thing we're going to do is create something that I call a router map, or at least we will in this implementation. And it's just going to be a service that allows us to keep track of all the different routes that we need to put into the fast route collector. So we're going to have a function here called addRoute, and we're going to have a method and a path and a request handler. And we're going to keep track of these in an array. And we're going to go ahead and just shape this array. It's really important that when you're dealing with these types of arrays that you let other people, even when that other person is future you in the future when you come back to this project, let them know what's in that array. It's super, super useful. So let's go ahead and then get that map in there and add our route. So we've got a method for the method, a path for the path, and a handler for the handler. So our route has been added. Let's add a method so that we can get the routes. And we're just going to go ahead and take this and repurpose it for our return statement as well. So now we can come back into our factory, and where our create router is, we can say we need that router map, and then pass all these routes into our route collector. So for each router map, get routes as route, and then route collector, add route, and then we're going to have route method, route path, and route handler. So our routes are going to get added to fast route correctly. Let's go ahead and start adding some request handlers. We're going to call those controllers today, and we're going to actually implement attribute or an interface from Annotated Container called a service attribute. What this does is it allows us to customize the functionality around the attribute that puts a service into the container. So it has a couple things that we need to define. We're not going to deal with profiles today, so we can just return an empty array. It doesn't make sense to have the concept of a primary controller in this context. So we're going to always return false there, and we're not going to worry about named controllers. We're going to mark this as an attribute, and then we're going to add a constructor that's going to define what our route is for this handler, all right? So we're going to have a public function that has our method and our path that should be that should be used for the implementation that this attribute is attached to. So let's implement our home controller. So we're going to have a controller namespace, and we're going to have a home controller. And it is a controller, and we want it to respond to get methods to the root directory. We're going to implement our request handler interface, and we're going to return that we're on the home page here. New callback stream, and we're going to wind up. We don't need to adjust the status code here because this is our first successful response. Now we need to get these added into our route map, our router map. That has not been done yet. So we're going to do that by hooking into another piece of annotated container functionality called the observer functionality that allows us to respond to when certain things happen in the life cycle of creating your container. So we're going to create an observer, and we're going to actually extend an abstract class provided by Annotated Container called Service Wiring Observer that's specifically designed around the functionality we're trying to accomplish today. So let's go ahead and implement that method. It passes in the container as well as a service called a service gatherer. So we're going to go ahead and get our router map here from the container. And again, we can be pretty confident that this is going to be the router map. So now what we need to do is get all of the services that could be a controller. So we're going to do this actually with our get services with attribute. So this is a convenience mechanism that's provided, and it's just going to return any services that were added to the container with the controller attribute. So we can be confident here that this is going to be a controller definition. This is specifically going to be a service and a service definition. It's a concept in container, in Annotated Container that's pretty important, and we're actually going to take advantage of some of that functionality today. So the controller is actually an attribute, remember, in this situation. So we're going to, from our service and definition, get the definition, and then we're going to get the attribute. The attribute here is an instantiated instance of controller specific to this, to the specific annotation. So it's going to have a get and that root path as the properties that we pass to the constructor. Again, we can be pretty confident that this is a controller. All right. And so now we need to add this to our router map. So we've got our controller with our method, our controller with our path, and our service and definition with the service that will be the request handler that actually handles the route that we set up here. So now that we've created an observer, again, like the definition provider, we need to configure it. We need to let Annotated Container know that it's there. So we have an observer, and we've got an Annotated Microframework AutoWire observer. And now it's going to hook into when the container is created, and it's going to get all of our controllers, and it's going to add this home request handler, and it should handle our homepage now. And instead of getting not found, we should get our homepage string. So assuming that everything's set up correctly, we can check Firefox out again and see that when we refresh, we get the home page just like we expected. So our micro framework, the foundation is started, but it's missing an important piece, and we're going to take just a little bit more time to get that implemented, and then I'm going to let you have the rest of your day or night. So we're going to create a new controller, and we're going to call it a Hello World controller, because of course, what kind of example wouldn't have one of these, right? So we're going to have a request handler, and we're going to have that controller attribute on it. And this time we're going to use fast routes functionality to define who you want to say hello to, right? So you can specify, are you saying hello to the world, or are you saying hello to somebody else? So we're going to get an attribute from our request, and we're going to call it who, and we're going to say that attribute is who, because that's the parameter name that we defined in our route path. So now we're going to return a response that has a body that includes who we're saying hello to. So we're going to say hello who, and we're excited about saying hello to them. So because we haven't set up this aspect of auto wiring yet, the who attribute is going to be null, and we're going to wind up seeing just hello with an exclamation mark. But I do want to go ahead and show you that the only thing we need to do now to add new request handlers and new routes is to add the attribute, and then when we go back over to our controller, if we go to hello world, we see that we have that hello comma exclamation mark because we don't have that attribute properly wired up yet. So let's take a look back at the code and show how we can get that implemented. So we're going to do that inside our application, and that information is actually the next part of our tuple in the route info. Our route info is going to have some params in it. It's going to be an associative array, and we're going to add that as the attributes in our request. So remember, requests in PSR-7 are immutable, so we're going to use request equals request with attribute, passing in the key and the value. So now when we go back to run our request again, we should see hello world. So let's go ahead and take a glance at Firefox again. And as you can see, we're now saying hello world. And let's go ahead and just say hello annotated container. Of course, why not? Yeah, this was a really exciting project. I'm glad that you sat with me through my screencast. I will be sure to leave a link to this repo on GitHub so you can take a look over the code and make improvements if you decide to. And again, thank you for taking the time to check my project out. I really appreciate it. Thanks.